A single room. No beds, no silence, no separation. Just bodies, parents, children, even animals curled together on straw, wrapped in scraps of cloth. Fleas bit through the night. Smoke from the hearth stung the eyes. Privacy didn't exist. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by noise, cold, and the shuffle of others shifting beside you. For medieval peasants, this wasn't unusual. It was normal. The way they slept reveals far more than discomfort. It exposes how people lived, survived, and shared everything. Even the dark dot in the medieval world, the setting sun, marked more than the end of labor. It signaled the beginning of uncertainty. Without electricity, artificial light came from torches, rushlights, or oil lamps, flickering sources that offered little visibility and less safety. Nightfall was not a neutral part of the day. It was something to endure. For the vast majority of people, peasants living in rural huts or cramped village homes, night meant retreat. Fields emptied. Tools were laid aside. Doors, if they existed, were bolted with wooden beams. In towns, gates were closed at dusk, locking out not just travelers, but potential threats, thieves, wolves, and the unknown. Fire was both a tool and a risk. One misplaced spark on a thatched roof could incinerate an entire hamlet. Candles, made of tallow or beeswax, were expensive and carefully rationed. Most families relied on rushlights, reeds dipped in fat which smoked heavily and burned quickly. These were not for comfort, but necessity. To feed a child, to check on livestock, to find a chamber pot in the dark. The layout of peasant homes offered no separation. A single room housed the entire family, and often their animals. Floors were dirt, walls were mud and straw. Ventilation was poor. The hearth at the center provided heat, but little illumination. As night fell, families gathered close, not for warmth alone, but because the dark beyond their walls was a world beyond control. Medieval sleep was shaped by a world, ruled by the rhythms of the sun and moon. Before artificial lighting, most people slept in two phases: first sleep and second sleep. The first began shortly after dusk and lasted until midnight. Then, for an hour or two, people would wake, sometimes to stoke fires, pray, or even socialize, and return to a second sleep until dawn. This segmented pattern, observed in texts from across Europe, was considered normal, not disrupted. Night brought not only practical challenges, but deep cultural and spiritual fears. The dark was associated with demons, sin, and the unknown. In religious texts and folklore, nighttime was when malevolent forces moved freely. Superstition governed behavior. Doors were marked with crosses, prayers were recited before bed, and charms were kept near infants to ward off evil. Yet for all its dangers, the night also brought reprieve. In a world of constant labor and obligation, darkness enforced rest. It was the only time when demands of the land, the church, or the Lord were silenced. In the stillness, people found a different kind of survival, less visible. But just as vital, night in the Middle Ages was not simply the absence of light. It was a threshold between the known and the unknown, a time of vulnerability, but also resilience. And as each evening descended, households across Europe repeated the same ancient ritual, drawing close, dimming the fire, and surrendering to the dark. Across medieval Europe, the typical peasant dwelling was a single-room structure, a compact space where life unfolded in full view. There were no hallways, no separate chambers, and certainly no bedrooms. The concept of personal space, as it's understood today, simply didn't exist. Most homes were constructed using locally available materials. Walls were often built from wattle and daub, thin wooden strips woven together like a basket, then plastered with a mixture of clay, mud, straw, and animal dung. Roofs were usually thatched with straw or reeds, offering some insulation but little protection from leaks or rodents. The floor was packed, earth often damp, uneven, and cold. In wealthier peasant households, a thin layer of straw might be laid down and replaced occasionally, but there were no floorboards or stone tiling. Those were luxuries reserved for the manor or the church. In these one-room homes, the hearth stood at the center. It was the primary source of heat, light, and cooking. Chimneys were rare in early medieval homes. Instead, smoke from the fire was expected to drift upward and escape through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the eaves. In winter, the smoke lingered, clinging to walls, clothing, and lungs. Yet without it, the family would freeze. Sleeping arrangements were communal by necessity. There might be a wooden platform or shared straw mattress in one corner of the room. Parents, children, and sometimes even grandparents slept side by side, often fully clothed. In colder months, livestock were brought indoors at night. Chickens, goats, or a pig would be penned in the same room, separated only by a low barrier or rope. Their body heat was not an inconvenience. It was a source of warmth. In these crowded quarters, privacy was an abstract idea. Bodily functions, childbirth, illness, arguments, all occurred within earshot and sight of others. For young children, this was normal. For adults, it meant navigating marriage, parenthood, and labor under constant observation. Modesty was enforced by behavior, not by architecture. These homes were not isolated dwellings. They were part of a broader manorial economy. Most peasants, known as villeins or serfs, lived in villages, governed by a local lord. In exchange for the right to cultivate small strips of land, they owed labor or rent, usually in the form of crops, livestock, or days worked on the lord's domain. The size of a home reflected a family's status and means, but even wealthier. Peasants rarely had more than 2 rooms. The architecture reflected a harsh truth. Survival required togetherness. Fires could not be tended alone. Children could not be left unsupervised. Food could not be wasted. There was no margin for solitude. Community and family were not just cultural values, they were structural necessities. Despite the squalor, these homes served their purpose. They sheltered families from rain, wind, and the dangers of the outside world. But they also shaped generations of people who knew the sound of every breath around them. A world where rest, intimacy, and vulnerability were always shared. The one-room house wasn't a flaw in medieval life. It was its foundation, a symbol of an age when daily life was fully exposed, and when survival left no room for walls. In the medieval peasant household, the bed was not a place of seclusion. It was a communal zone, functional, exposed, and deeply embedded in the rhythms of survival. Most families shared a single bed or a sleeping platform made of straw or hay stuffed into coarse linen sacks, supported by wooden frames or sometimes placed directly on the ground. This was not a bed in the modern sense. It was not a retreat from the world, but a continuation of it where warmth was pooled from proximity and where the acts of daily life continued, uninterrupted by walls or curtains. Marriage offered no privacy. Husbands and wives slept beside their children, and often in the presence of extended family or even servants. In rural homes, where the entire household might consist of a single room, Everything occurred within sight and sound of everyone else. Expressions of intimacy, verbal or physical, had to be measured. There was no expectation of discretion, because discretion was rarely possible. Sexual relations between married couples were carried out quietly at night, often while others in the room pretended to sleep. Affection was understood as a necessity of life, not a private indulgence, and children were born in that same bed, delivered by women of the household or local midwives, while others stood nearby. The line between public and private did not exist. It had no architectural or cultural space to form. This lack of physical separation also shaped the emotional lives of medieval peasants. Arguments between spouses, scoldings of children, and grief over illness or death all took place in shared space. These were communal experiences, absorbed by all who lived under the same roof. Legal and religious institutions occasionally addressed this reality. Church teachings emphasized marital fidelity and modesty, but they also acknowledged the impossibility of full separation. In 13th century England, for instance, church courts occasionally heard cases involving adultery or sexual misconduct, but testimonies often referenced multiple people witnessing or overhearing events in shared homes. Privacy, even in transgression, was rare among wealthier households. Modesty was preserved through the use of bed curtains or partitioned chambers. But for most rural peasants, such luxuries were out of reach. A simple woven cloth might hang for warmth or for shade from the hearth, but not for concealment. The family bed was not only a place of rest, but also of work. Spinning, mending, and nursing occurred there. In colder regions, people stayed in bed longer, not for comfort, but to conserve body heat. In some accounts, even communal storytelling or evening prayers were shared before sleep. As families lay together in semi-darkness. Across Europe, this pattern persisted for centuries. The Industrial Revolution improved architecture, and rising standards of living would eventually redefine the idea of privacy. But in the medieval period, survival was prioritized over space. The bed, in its most basic form, reflected that truth. For medieval peasants, there was no door to close, no silence to escape to. The family bed was where life began, unfolded, and ended, shared out in the open, and always within reach of another. In medieval peasant life, the separation between human and animal was not defined by walls, but by function. For families living in rural Europe, livestock were not just economic assets, they were living, breathing necessities. And when night fell, they came inside. Bringing animals into the home was not a sentimental gesture, it was a pragmatic one. Pigs, chickens, goats, and sometimes even cows were kept indoors during the colder months, particularly in northern and central Europe. In the absence of insulation or central heating, animal body heat helped maintain the fragile warmth of a poorly built dwelling. A cow could generate a surprising amount of heat in an enclosed space, and for a family living through a harsh winter, that could mean the difference between survival and frostbite. The layout of peasant homes reflected this reality. A cottage often featured a sunken area or partition near the entrance, known in parts of Germany as a stall or byre, where animals were tied or fenced in. In the British Isles, some early medieval longhouses were literally split into two zones, one for humans, one for animals. The floors were dirt, sometimes sloped to allow waste to drain away. In the morning, animal droppings were shoveled out and repurposed either as fertilizer or, when mixed with straw, as fuel. In France, particularly in colder highland areas like the Auvergne, entire architectural traditions developed around this concept. The maison block combined human and animal living quarters under a single roof. The livestock occupied the ground floor, while the family lived above, warmed by rising heat and insulated by the presence of the animals below. This proximity was not without consequence. Fleas, lice, and other parasites circulated easily. The risk of zoonotic diseases, such as anthrax or bovine tuberculosis, increased. Sanitation was minimal. Yet for many peasant families, the risks were balanced against the sheer necessity of keeping animals alive and protecting their own from the cold. Domestication did not mean full control. Pigs could be aggressive. Roosters crowed before dawn. Cattle sometimes broke loose. And yet, these disruptions were part of the texture of daily life. Children grew up knowing the sounds and smells of livestock as intimately as they did those of their siblings. The line between the wild and the domestic was blurred, not metaphorically, but spatially. Church authorities and medical writers occasionally commented on this shared space. Some moralists viewed it as unclean or improper, but these views were more common among the elite, who could afford separate stables and servants. For the average peasant, moral purity took a back seat to pragmatic survival. Even as towns expanded and architectural norms evolved, the practice continued in parts of rural Europe into the early modern period. What began as a necessity persisted as tradition, and in the quiet of the medieval night, long before the invention of glass windows or coal furnaces, warmth came not from solitude, but from the low breath of a cow resting just a few feet away. Before the advent of artificial lighting, sleep looked profoundly different than it does today. Across medieval Europe, it was not a single continuous stretch of rest, but a divided rhythm known as first sleep and second sleep. This segmented pattern was not only common, it was considered normal, especially among rural and working populations. By nightfall, often just after sunset, homes darkened quickly. Without gas lamps or electric light, there was little reason to stay awake. Candles and rushlights were precious and not to be wasted. As a result, most peasant families retired early, often within an hour or two of sundown. This began the first phase of sleep, typically lasting from early evening until around midnight. What followed was a period of wakefulness, anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour or more, before drifting into what was known as the second sleep, which would carry through until dawn. This period between sleeps was not seen as a disturbance or a problem, but as an expected part of the night. Historical references to this sleep pattern appear across a wide range of sources. In 13th century England, medical texts by physicians like Bartholomeus Anglicus refer to the two-part sleep cycle. In 15th century France, court records describe villagers waking after first sleep to pray or check on livestock. The phrase first sleep appears in Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, and is also noted by early modern writers such as Thomas Tryon and Roger Echorch, whose later research in the 21st century would bring renewed scholarly attention to the phenomenon. During this nocturnal interlude, peasants might tend to small tasks, skindling the hearth, adjusting bedding, or stepping outside to relieve themselves. Some prayed, as monastic influence emphasized midnight as a sacred hour. Others whispered quietly to family members nearby, shared thoughts, or even engaged in sex. In some communities, this time was used to visit neighbors, check on the ill, or perform quiet chores. The silence of the village and the natural darkness created an atmosphere of stillness, but not of total sleep. This practice wasn't limited to peasants. The biphasic pattern appeared across class lines. However, in poorer households where people slept in tighter quarters with animals nearby, the midnight interval offered a brief moment of pause within a densely shared life. It was a time when the fire was stirred, the embers reignited, and sometimes, when stories were softly spoken in the dark, the structure of time itself supported this pattern. Church bells often rang to mark midnight prayers. In monasteries, the Matin service was observed in the middle of the night. This shaped the broader perception that waking in the darkness was both spiritually and practically normal. The shift away from segmented sleep came gradually with the rise of artificial illumination. By the 17th and 18th centuries, in larger towns and among wealthier classes, candles and oil lamps extended the day. Sleep schedules compressed. Eventually, the Industrial Revolution and factory time replaced organic rhythms with regimented hours. But in the medieval world, segmented sleep reflected a relationship with nature and darkness that modern societies have largely forgotten. For centuries, night was not a singular void, but a layered, living experience. The space between first and second sleep was not wasted time. It was time reclaimed, ritualized, meaningful, and shaped by the slow, quiet pulse of the pre-electric world. Sleep in the medieval countryside was anything but silent. In the absence of glass windows, insulated walls, or private bedrooms, peasants did not drift off into quiet stillness. Instead, they slept in the middle of a living world, one that rarely stopped moving or making noise. The average peasant home was a one-room structure, often built from timber, wattle, and daub, with a thatched roof overhead. These materials offered minimal sound insulation. At night, the house amplified life rather than muffling it. Families slept in close quarters, parents, children, and sometimes extended kin and straw mattresses, blankets of coarse wool, or simple piles of hay. Every cough, every murmur, every restless turn could be heard by all. Outside, the wind moved through loose wooden panels and thatching. The groaning of old timber beams or the sudden thud of a shifting roof tile was common. Rain and wind echoed through gaps in the walls, and with no chimneys in many peasant dwellings, the smell of smoke and the sounds of crackling fire lingered through the dark. Livestock added their own chorus. Chickens rustled in corners. Goats and pigs stirred in their sleep. Cows shifted their weights. In colder months, when animals were brought indoors to share warmth with their human keepers, their snorts, breaths, and hooves were part of the nightly atmosphere. Insects were an ever-present nuisance. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs thrived in straw bedding and thatch. The itching and scratching became yet another source of nighttime movement. Snoring, wheezing, the ragged breath of the elderly or sick, these were all part of what it meant to rest inside a communal life. Silence, when it came, was rare, and it wasn't always comforting. In the countryside, quiet could signal something wrong: a predator in the henhouse, a thief at the door, or worse, death nearby. A sudden pause in the usual night sounds could bring tension rather than relief. Medieval sleep was porous. Rest came in fragments, and every night was shared with the hum of the world continuing just inches away. In this setting, sleep was not an escape from life, but simply another posture within it. Boundaries between the waking and sleeping world were thin. Dreams came, if they came at all, with the sounds of laboring breath, distant dogs, and a house very much alive around you in the medieval world. Privacy was not a universal expectation. It was a luxury carefully constructed, guarded, and reserved for the elite. While peasants slept communally in one-room cottages shared with family and livestock, the nobility carved out entire chambers devoted to solitude and sleep. The difference was not just comforted, was hierarchy made visible in wood, stone, and fabric. Noble households, particularly from the 12th century onward, featured private bedchambers, often set apart from public halls. In castles or manor houses, these rooms were located in upper levels or behind thick wooden doors, accessible only to family and trusted servants. Within them stood large ornate beds, framed in oak, elevated from the cold ground, and often draped in heavy curtains. These were not just functional, they were architectural statements of status. The four-poster bed, emerging in widespread use by the 14th century, was more than a place to sleep. It symbolized personal space, shielded from the eyes and ears of others. Curtains helped insulate against drafts, but they also enclosed the sleeper in a world of their own. Inside, one might lie on a feather mattress stitched from linen and filled with down, an unthinkable luxury to those laboring outside the castle walls. Linens were changed, bedding was scented. Some noblemen even owned nightgowns made from silk or fine wool, while peasants slept in their clothes. Bedsheets and blankets were part of household inventories, listed in wills and dowries. In 1415, the will of Lady Alice West included mention of a green silk bed canopy with gold embroidery, a reminder that beds like tapestries and jewelry were portable signs of wealth. This privacy extended beyond sleep. Lords and ladies could choose when to be seen. Retiring to one's chamber became an act of status. By contrast, for the average peasant, the concept of retiring didn't exist. Life was lived and slept out in the open. Servants reinforced the architecture of separation. Chamberlains and handmaids managed access to noble sleeping quarters. They brought heated stones to warm bedding, poured water for nighttime washing, and ensured candles were extinguished or kept burning at a safe distance. Even the act of closing a bed curtain was mediated by social structure. This contrast in sleeping conditions reflected broader inequalities. Castles and manor houses were designed to isolate and protect both from external threats and internal proximity. Stone walls kept out the cold. Tapestries muffled sound. Glass windows, rare and expensive, filtered light without compromising warmth or privacy. In medieval Europe, the bed became a boundary between worlds. To sleep alone was not just about rest, it was about dignity, autonomy, and power. Privacy was not an assumed right. It had to be built, furnished, and defended. For the noble, a bed offered silence, separation, and control. For the poor, it remained a shared act of survival. In the medieval world, peasant life was defined by hardship, unrelenting labor, exposure to the elements, and the constant presence of hunger and disease. Yet amid this daily struggle, sleep endured. However crude or uncomfortable, rest remained an essential ritual of survival. Peasant homes were often no more than one-room cottages, constructed from wattle and daub, roofed with thatch and floored with packed dirt. These structures offered limited protection from cold, wind, or moisture. In the rainy seasons, leaks were common. Rats and insects shared the space. Chimneys were rare. Smoke from open hearths blackened the walls and stung the eyes. Yet even in these conditions, people slept because they had to. Sleeping arrangements were communal. Parents, children, and even animals occupied the same confined quarters. Beds, where they existed, were typically wooden frames stuffed with straw, hay, or bracken. Blankets might be old wool or patched cloth, handed down over generations. In colder climates, warmth came not just from cloth, but from proximity family members huddled together, conserving body heat through shared presence. For those without a bed, the floor sufficed. Straw was scattered, sometimes layered with rushes or old sacks. There was no expectation of silence or solitude. Snoring, coughing, the sounds of livestock, these were part of the night's atmosphere. But for peasants, sleep was not an indulgence. It was necessary recovery from long hours spent ploughing fields, hauling water, or tending livestock from dawn to dusk. Illness and fatigue were common, but so too was resilience. In the absence of comfort, people adapted. They made use of what they had: wooden shutters to block cold, coarse wool to cushion skin, simple rituals to mark the transition into rest. In parts of Europe, folk prayers were spoken before bed, not as ceremony, but as a psychological shield against the dangers of the night. Children grew up in this environment. Sleep was not quiet or orderly, but it was reliable. A shared blanket under a leaky roof could still bring peace. In many peasant families, the very act of sleeping side by side reinforced bonds. It reminded them daily that they were enduring life together. Despite the poverty, despite the discomfort, peasants slept. Not well, perhaps, but enough to rise again. In that simple act of closing eyes, of finding warmth where there was little rest, became its own form of resistance, a quiet assertion of life against all odds. Today, the bedroom is a symbol of privacy. Walls, doors, and locks promise solitude. A king-size mattress offers space far beyond necessity, and the quiet hum of electronics has replaced the sound of breathing kin or restless livestock. But this modern stillness is new. For most of human history, the act of sleeping was anything but private. The transition from communal sleep to individualized bedrooms was neither sudden nor uniform. In medieval Europe, as in much of the world, sleep was a shared necessity. It took centuries of architectural evolution, urban planning, and economic change to transform domestic space. By the 17th and 18th centuries, wealthier households in England and France began to divide interior space into specialized rooms, parlors, studies, chambers. The bedchamber became not just a place to sleep, but a marker of class. By the Victorian era, moral codes emphasized modesty and separation. Middle-class families increasingly adopted the idea that children should sleep apart from parents, and that marital intimacy should be shielded from household eyes. These values shaped modern expectations, where each person, ideally, had a bed, a room, even a schedule of their own. Industrialization accelerated the divide. As workers moved into tenement housing in growing cities, privacy became a goal, rather than a reality. But with rising incomes, especially in the 20th century, housing trends favored ever larger homes with individualized spaces. Post-war suburbs in the United States solidified the norm. A separate room for each child, a master bedroom for parents, and silence as the standard of nighttime rest. But in gaining space, something was lost. In surveys today, many in the modern world report sleeping alone, even within relationships. Loneliness, insomnia, and sleep disorders are common. The communal rest that once provided warmth, connection, and reassurance has faded. Screens glow into the early hours. Families, though living under one roof, often sleep apart. Sleep is more comfortable now. Mattresses are engineered. Temperatures are controlled. But are people more rested or simply more isolated? The medieval peasant may have drifted off beside a cow, a sibling, or a parent. They lacked privacy, but not presence. Today's sleeper lies surrounded by walls, silence, and connectivity, yet often alone, from haylofts to high thread count. Sheets, the way we sleep has changed, but the deeper needs for warmth, for security, for belonging remain. Perhaps the echoes of that one-room world still linger, not in architecture, but in the quiet questions we ask when the lights go out